While we're getting my slides up, so I'm going to share about the role land conservation can play in protecting our drinking water sources. And again, I'm Michelle with the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts and their water project manager. And to start briefly, I wanted to introduce the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts, which is a statewide coalition of over 30 member organizations that work with local communities to protect water quality, wildlife habitat, preserve open lands, maintain working farms and ranches, and protect the landscapes that help us retain the social and economic values that make Oregon special.
I'm trying to figure out how to make it full screen. You see?
And the next slide, I'll tee it up, is just a map of our member organization land trusts. And we have the Wetlands Conservancy and Mackenzie River Trust, Margaret and Katie here today. And a land trust or conservancy is a community-based nonprofit organization that actively works to permanently conserve land. And there are local land trusts. Mackenzie River Trust works in a local geography to support communities and landscapes. The Wetlands Conservancy, this is perfect, I'm glad you're both here. It's a statewide organization that works across the state to support specific types of geographies. And then we also have national land trust organizations that have partnered. The Conservation Fund is an example that works on the Oregon coast and wants to help support communities in protecting their source water areas. So lots of different organizations that can help you implement some of these tools I'm going to share about today. So next slide. So as Alyssa shared, source water protection refers to the tools that address both the quality and quantity of our drinking water sources. And again, these are the sources of where we get our drinking water. So the stream or the aquifer, or when we turn on our tap, we don't see it, but that's where the water is coming from. And the quality of that water is what determines in large part the quality of what comes out of our tap. And so Alyssa went over this really well. There are several sources of pollution, and controlling, I think what I'd point out here is that these are tied to land uses in large measure. And so how we use our land, how we farm, how we do forestry practices, how we live in the world, our urban landscapes really has a huge impact on what goes into our water systems. And so that's why there's a link between the pollution, land uses, land conservation. So next slide. So to address these types of pollution sources, communities rely on a variety of tools. And what you'll predominantly see on this list, and there are probably many more than this, but they're largely voluntary. Because as Alyssa pointed out, usually within your watershed you have a lot of different owners, and they're largely not public, and I'll show that in a minute. And so what you're relying on are voluntary tools, working with landowners and land users to help them understand how their uses impact drinking water and what they can do to prevent those impacts. So education is one, partnerships, we were talking about that here today, incentives, so maybe providing funding for land owners or land users to implement practices that might improve your water quality, restoration, so where land has been degraded, creating healthy landscapes again. Land use laws is one that where you could do zoning. There's some zoning or land use planning that might help ensure that land uses are consistent with your drinking water goals, and then land conservation. So land conservation is unique among the tools I described because it provides a mechanism for communities to use legal tools and voluntary work with property owners to protect natural lands, to ensure that those lands are managed consistent with and to improve the security, reliability, and quality of your drinking water. And land conservation refers to the use of voluntary legal tools to secure long-term protection for natural lands for their values and services. So habitat protection, scenic preservation, urban revitalization, historic preservation, cultural purposes, recreational opportunities, and then I'll wrap it up with the one we're here to talk about today, drinking water, source water protection. And healthy natural lands play an important role in keeping water clean and sufficient, and I just chatted about that. Natural lands keep water clean by filtering water before it reaches the stream, keep water cool by shading our rivers. It slows the flow, so it reduces the pollutants that are entering the water and also helps water get into the aquifer. I don't think there's anything else on this slide. There was something else, and it'll come back to me, and I'll add it in. Next slide. So land conservation can be a particularly powerful tool when there's a lot of private ownership in your watershed. This chart shows land ownership in Oregon statewide, and you'll notice that most of it, if you can see that, is private. Can you see the pie things? Can you help me point?
Yeah, which one are we?
So private, industrial forest, agriculture, kind of everything on the left right there is private. And then you have Forest Service is the green, the brown is Bureau of Land Management. Just that tiny little sliver, 0.3% is local government. And then you have some tribal properties. So large chunks are private land, tiny chunk is local government. And these numbers of private land are even bigger on the coast. So that's kind of why land conservation can be really important, particularly for coastal communities in Oregon and across Oregon. So Alyssa already mentioned this, great source of mapping, and one thing it allows you to do is it took the DEQ source water assessment data and put it in kind of user-friendly maps. And one piece where we're thinking about land conservation is a lot of coastal watersheds are pretty small. They're drinking watersheds, which is a great thing when you're thinking about land conservation and protection, because it's kind of a manageable bite to think about. Some of them are really big, but that doesn't mean that land conservation can't be a really good tool. And one way to help prioritize lands for conservation is to think about where they are, what the land uses are, what the property ownership is, and what the natural characteristics of those lands are, and where are the high-risk areas that we should be prioritizing for conservation. And this mapping tool gives you a couple layers, slope susceptibility, land ownership type, forest cut, that can all help you start thinking about that in kind of a visual way. Next slide. So at a high level, I'm just going to mention the tools for land conservation, different models that you can think about when you're using these tools, and then probably won't have time for benefits, but Alyssa went over these in a really great way. So a couple tools. Land ownership, conceptually the simplest type of land conservation. You purchase the property, maybe it's donated if you're lucky, but usually you purchase it, and then you own it outright. And the benefits are that it provides the greatest control for the community and the greatest flexibility to manage it long term for your particular goals. Drinking water, since we're here, being one of those. It can also provide benefits in that it allows the community to manage the property for multiple benefits, which could include income generated from timber harvest that might be consistent with drinking water goals or needed for restoration. So that's another benefit. And recreation, if it's consistent with drinking water, since we're chatting about here today. The challenges are it can cost a lot of money to purchase land. The state has a new great program that it'll be setting up, which is really exciting. That's funds for source water protection. So that'll get rolled out. And there are other sources of funding that are, I'm going to plug the sheet again, on the sheet that can help with purchase. But then long-term stewardship, when you own land and you want to keep it healthy for drinking water, it does take active stewardship. A lot of the time this land has been cut, timber harvested, so it might take restoration. Conservation easement, second kind of common one, is a legal agreement between the landowner and an easement holder that limits the use of land to protect certain values. So functionally what an easement does is it restricts property uses, such as the type of land uses or where they can occur on the property, in order to prevent those land uses from impairing the natural values the conservation easement protects. So an example would be restricting road building or the use of pesticides next to a drinking water source. Kind of be a very narrow targeted easement. By law, conservation easements are protected in perpetuity and they can't be dissolved. Easements still cost money. Usually you pay the property owner for the easement, and the cost is the difference between the property appraised if all uses were allowed and what it would be if you could no longer use it for forestry or you can't put a house on it. And so what the appraiser does is it tries to calculate what the difference in the value of the property is. And so you would pay for that. So it still costs money. Also requires that the easement holder monitor and enforce an easement, which can take capacity time to do that. And so those are the, sorry. Cost is that it's cheaper, is I think what I was going for on the slide. And then less management in that you don't have to own the property and manage it. And then the challenges are enforcement, as I just mentioned, and then complexity. It can be complex if you haven't worked with easements, to come up with easement language and work through that process, which is where I'll point to land trust as a good partner in that. Sorry, Margaret, I call you out a lot. Deed restriction is a tool where you record certain management restrictions in the deed. And these are usually a management agreement that would say you can't cut, you need to have a bigger buffer than is required by law, and you put that in the deed so it becomes enforceable technically against both current and future property owners. The problem with these is that they can be dissolved. And so they're easier to put on, they're generally cheaper to negotiate with the landowner, but they're not as permanent. So that's the challenge with those. I'm just looking at my time, so next slide. And then these are just models, and so I just wanted to get everyone thinking. We have these tools we can use, and there are lots of different ways that communities can use each of these tools. So across the top, let's say you wanted to acquire land and protect it. There are a lot of different folks that might be a good owner long-term for that property. The community, the public water system, maybe they want to own it and that would be great. Maybe they don't feel like they have the capacity. Maybe a land trust member would be a good fit if it aligned with their goals as well. Maybe there's a tribal partner. Maybe the land would actually get purchased and then given to a state or federal agency to be managed as a park. I mean, there's a lot of different models, even if you said, I'm not the right owner for that. And then land exchange is a way that you can acquire property, and Astoria used this when they were first purchasing land within their watershed. There was a timber harvest, and they actually exchanged a property outside of the drinking water area for the cut property. And so they were able to start acquiring land within their watershed using land exchange. And this can also be done in some circumstances with state and federal agencies. Bridge buyer is another model, and here a nonprofit entity would come in and purchase the property and hold it, which would give the community or the partner who's going to be purchasing that property long-term time to get funding and resources together to do that. So it takes away that kind of market push that often is a barrier to communities purchasing property. And then community forest is a management model, and this would be the community would buy it, and it provides a model for communities to manage it collectively for community benefit. And Daniel, I'll point at Daniel for that one. Next slide. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, and this is the guide that COLT put together, and it goes over in more detail kind of what these tools are, how you can use them, where there are funding sources available, and has a kind of how do I start thinking about land conservation, what are the steps I should be thinking about, who would I partner with to reach out to landowners, when should I do that, and so this has a host of information. And then the next slide is just me, I think. Not my face, but just my information. Thank goodness. Okay, and then I'm done.